This is the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast with Garry Taylor.
Hello and welcome to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Hope you are well. If you have listened to previous episodes, you are aware that HWM Walton-on-Thames have appeared several times, latterly covering the DB12 launch, actually on the launch day itself, and more recently reviewing the Newport Pagnell Vanquish and dispelling many of the gearbox myths. I often introduce HWM as the world's oldest Aston Martin dealer, and then we launch into whatever that podcast is about. It struck me that it should be a podcast about HWM itself, for not only being a very well established and respected AM dealer, but also with it having an illustrious racing history in Formula 1, Formula 2 and sports cars, often run on a shoestring, and having none other than Sterling Moss and others as part of the driver lineup. So to address this, I'm pleased to be here at Walton-on-Thames with Guy Jenner, the CEO of the company, to cover the full HWM story. Hello, Guy.
Hello, Gary. Welcome back to HWM.
What does HWM stand for?
A basic question to ease me in, Gary. Thank you. HWM simply stands for Hersham and Walton Motors. So when the business was founded, we had property both in Hersham and Walton. But interestingly, there was a long-standing urban myth about HWM that it stood for Harry Webb's Motors. Harry Webb being Cliff Richard's actual name.
Oh, yes.
And so where that came from was that back in the day we had a petrol station forecourt, and Cliff actually was a customer of HWM, so he owned an Aston Martin, and locals would often see him, this would have been the 70s, filling up his Aston on our petrol station forecourt, probably quite regularly, knowing 70s Astons, and people put two and two together and came up with 10. And assumed HWM was his business. So for a long time, even today, people come in and say, "Oh, this is Harry Webb's garage, isn't it?"
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I think we should roll with that.
All right. Well, we'll go with Harry Webb's Motors. Yeah.
So how was it formed? Where did the names come from? Hersham and Walton, they're the local towns at the time?
Exactly right. So we're based in Walton-on-Thames today. We do have part of our business in Hersham still. And we were founded, not at the best of times, we were founded in 1938. Not the ideal time to start a business, but we're founded by a gentleman called John Heath, or Baron John Heath, to give him his proper title. And John was an engineer, first of all, and the reason why we really refer to him as a baron is he was a man that felt that anyone who got dirt under his fingernails for a living should not call himself a baron. And so he was kind of more inclined to be in the workshop rolling up his sleeves helping the team rather than sitting in an office. He was that sort of practically minded guy. And John started the business to go racing.
Did he have money?
He did. But really, I guess the big story of HWM starts post-war, and frankly, that was a period when really nobody had any money. Yeah. Tough time. So we'll talk about the second character in the HWM story, which is George Abecassis. Both of them were men of means, but they weren't men of a level of wealth that was perhaps at the same sort of heady reaches of a manufacturer. These were guys trying to create something from a relatively small pot of cash. So the theme back then was money was always tight, and the business was set up buying and selling cars simply to fund going racing. It was all about racing.
Okay. So you said it was founded by John Heath in 1938.
1938, yes, exactly right. So World War II kicks off, and John, being an engineer, gravitated towards engineering elements for the war effort, so he stayed back in the UK. Meantime, there's a young up-and-coming racing driver called George Abecassis, who had started to make a bit of a name for himself pre-war, who then, when World War II kicked off, decided he wanted to be a pilot, a bomber pilot. George was a courageous guy, brave driver, and that reflected in his attitude to everything he did in life. So he had to try quite hard to be recruited to the bomber squadron, which is what he had his mindset on, purely because he had American parents. It wasn't a post that he could simply walk into, but he finally got himself accepted, and ended up flying 26 successful flights for Bomber Command in a period of time where, on average, you had kind of 40% chance of losing your life in a flight. And I think, those race car skills and coordination lend themselves to being a pilot, and I think he was just naturally talented. And so, having had that successful run of flights, he was then asked to train pilots, which, frankly, I think he found a bit pedestrian. But one of the things he'd do to entertain himself on the way back from a training session is take the helm and kick out one bank of the engines just before landing, and land with just the other side of engines operating.
Okay.
And I think he did this for two reasons. One, he loved to frighten the young recruits that he was training, and he found that quite amusing. But the other thing is, we lost a huge amount of our pilots during that period due to accidents in aircraft that were kind of the hand-me-down aircraft that were used for training. So I think George could see that this could potentially help him out at some point in his life. And so the next step in his career was he was recruited by the Special Operation Executive. And this was a secret and elite force that would execute all sorts of things for the government in terms of the war effort. In particular, their pilots, who were hand-picked, would fly bombers that were stripped out. They just had a gunner at the back, and they'd carry out low-level flights at night to go and drop off supplies, pick up dignitaries, run spies in across enemy lines. It was enormously dangerous work, very difficult, because they just used moonlight and maps to plan out the flights, all done by the pilots up front. And George was very adept at this, and it went very well until it didn't, until he got engaged in a gunfight one night over Denmark. He had 6 people on board. A German pilot started shooting at the aircraft he was flying and ended up killing his gunner in the fight, and shot out one bank of engines. So what do you know, in the middle of the night here across Denmark, George was left having to land this aircraft in the dark with just one bank of engines.
Yes.
And so all of that training he carried out, landing aircraft, partly for a giggle, actually ended up saving his
useful
life and everybody's life on
Yeah.
board. So he landed the aircraft successfully, and everybody made a break for it. Him and one other ended up getting picked up, and he became a prisoner of war in Stalag Luft 3, which is where The Great Escape was based on.
Right.
So that had just occurred, and so George sat out the rest of the war. It was pretty boring for him, but he dreamt of racing and cars, and so when the Russians came in and liberated, he was unsure of whether it was good news or bad news, and he stole a bicycle and made his way back to the UK and got picked up by Allies in France. So it's an interesting story, and I tell that story because that gives you just a feel for the calibre of the guys that started the business and what shaped them. And George was always, his nickname was, we had 2 nicknames. One was Fearless George, or
Right.
Courageous George, and the other one was Gorgeous George, which was definitely a nickname that he gave himself and just spread around a bit.
I can understand that.
Yeah,
I understand.
yeah.
I've read that he was deemed, whereas John Heath was, as you say, dirt under the fingernails and
Yep.
quite rough and ready. Gorgeous George was always very well turned out, quite elegant in his manner, style.
He was, yeah. So interesting. So John Heath was a tall, well turned out man. The interesting thing he'd do is he'd be well dressed, then roll up his sleeves and go in the workshop and get dirty whilst being dressed
Right.
immaculately. So, but because of that, he had a team who had enormous respect for him, and it meant that they would do anything to support him, and it enabled HWM to go on and build a Grand Prix team that achieved things that, frankly, were beyond the sum of the parts that existed within the business. So that was kind of a really important part of his characteristic, particularly in an era where there was this kind of dramatic class divide of upper class and working class, and John just broke down that barrier and just got on with things, and the guys really respected him for that.
In 1938, John started a garage.
He did.
Was it just a regular garage, filling station parts, etc., etc.?
Exactly right.
And then George came in later after the war, was it?
So, yeah.
How did they meet?
War finishes, and George, his wife, arranged a dinner party to welcome George back from war. The food would have still been distinctly average because there was significant rationing, but the point is, it was a celebration of George returning in one piece. And at that gathering was John Heath, and they spent the night talking about racing, their love of cars. John could race. George was a more successful driver, but they both agreed that they wanted to do more racing, and more than anything their dream was to build their own cars and fly the flag for Britain. The beauty of HWM at that point is, because we were a relatively small concern, we were nimble, and they were men of action, so they came back, cracked on, built cars and went racing. And where they started was, George had been campaigning a Grand Prix car called an Alta, made locally, really strong cars, very successful, and George was getting some great results. So they realised that the engine was a great basis for a car. So they took Alta engines, and the first car that was built was the Streamliner. So this is the first HWM race car. Interestingly, George's first actual competition was at Aston Clinton Hill Climb. It's a nice link. But the first HWM was the Streamliner, and it looked like a really advanced car. It was the first car was actually based on the Alta engine and chassis, and then latterly we started building our own chassis as well. It was an impressive looking vehicle, and this was a period of time where there was very little in the way of racing going on in the UK. Hill climbs were really the thing back at home, whilst in Europe there was a growing race scene, and attitudes to racing were a bit more relaxed out there, so cities were putting on Grand Prix.
We were quite restricted over here, weren't we, for some reason or another?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. In mainland Europe, races were being put on, and the race organisers were looking for great race teams to turn up to create an attraction. John and George were always very much minded they wanted to turn out beautiful looking cars, beautifully engineered, that looked the part, that turned up immaculate, that were just so. And they recognised that was a really important part of the offering of going and racing in Europe. And because this was such a tight budget affair, the real critical thing was getting invited to a race, to get the start money. It was so tight that generally what they would have to do is race for the weekend. Once the weekend was complete, the organisers would pay out the start money. They would use that money to then fuel the beaten up old bus they were using to carry the race cars to get them to the next race. But they made it work, and the first couple of seasons were experimentation, and then they started to grow in their presence in Europe, and that's when they needed to start looking for appropriate talent to drive their cars, to ensure that they were going to push on and get the right results.
And Guy, what talent as well, because the talent they attracted was, among others, there was Peter Collins, Lance Macklin, and someone called Sterling Moss, which I believe he was like 19 years old at the time, and I think I read somewhere it was his first professional drive.
Well, that's right. So I mean, first of all, you're running a race team on next to no budget. You need some talent. What do you do? The one thing that George was very good at was he had an eye for racing talent. The only solution for them was, rather than to get proven talent, was to try and spot fresh, up-and-coming talent. And so, yes, the most famous...
And they were cheap.
You're dead right. Exactly that. That was the key. They were cheap if you got the talent early enough. And yes, our first most famous recruit was Sterling Moss, and Sterling was running a little Cooper 500 as a privateer, and this is an era where I think Bernie Ecclestone was knocking about in Cooper 500s back in the day.
I think you're right, yes.
I don't know whatever happened to him, but anyway,
no.
Sterling really stood out to George, and so they approached him and said, "Look, do you want a proper job? We'll pay you." They struck a deal, and Sterling came on board, and it was Sterling's first paid drive.
Yes.
And he raced for us for 2 years. So this would have been 1950 onwards, when we were really gearing up as a race team. I mean, Sterling was an incredible part of the team, and he reflected a number of times that HWM and his time at HWM was a core part of his development. Of course, if you are an underdog team, you end up having to learn to overdrive a car almost. And, well, not almost, he did have to overdrive a car to get the kind of results that was expected of that came out of HWM.
Was this in Formula 1 or Formula 2?
So it was Formula 2.
Yeah.
But there were periods where, I mean, here we were as a race team going out to mainland Europe with our broken down bus with cars in the back. We'd be on the same podium as the likes of Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, and there were times when we were ahead of the F1 boys in our F2 car.
The garages.
Garagista. That's right, as Enzo would sort of dismiss. Yeah, exactly. He would sort of we were classic garagistas.
Now, have we forgot to mention that the whole operation came from this site where we are now?
Exactly right. Yes. Yeah. So these cars, we'll put images up for people to see, but you can go into our workshop today and then look at some images of our cars in build in the 50s.
Yeah.
It's the same place. Yep.
Incredible.
It's wonderful. I mean, to the point where this was an era where, again, restrained budgets. Our first cars, the chassis and designs, were chalked out on our workshop floor. It was that rudimentary. It got more advanced as time moved on, but nevertheless, the team here were able to turn out cars that were able to compete at the highest level. And Sterling, his career with us, it was either crashes, it was either breaking cars because they were patched up and returned to track, or it was getting some unbelievable results.
With these results, was it being recognised by the Great British public at the time? Because I think a lot of the noise, pun intended, was towards BRM with their V16, and this was going to be the great British hope to beat the foreigners. But that failed miserably, didn't it?
Well, it did. So
despite the money,
quite right. Yeah. So the BRM, yes, the BRM project was a really ambitious project, and you're dead right. It was kind of stealing the headlines, as it were, in motorsport, and it was this most amazing thing that was being created. But it became so complicated, so expensive to do, and so time-consuming that actually, by the time that had got track ready, the rules had changed, and it kind of wasn't viable as an offering. So yeah, I mean that was a project that was unsuccessful. It was the opposite to HWM. HWM were that nimble team that made things work. They created race cars out of parts that were already available, and the simplicity of their setup and their nimbleness meant they just went out and went racing. Was it recognised? Well, there's no doubt that we, post-World War II, we were the most significant British race team, and we were actually the first proper works team that went to Europe and went racing properly. The guys that were racing for us were famous and were very, very well known in terms of their day. And just to give you an idea of how well known we were, you could probably see over there's a dinky toy box of an HWM race car.
Oh yes.
I mean, they turned out, I don't know how many, but a lot of dinky toy versions of our HWM Grand Prix cars. They're not difficult to buy online now. So there was definitely a period in time where we were a household name as a Grand Prix team, for sure. And we'll talk about next some of the other drivers that raced the business, but again, they were all really, really well known in their day.
You mentioned about they travelled long distances. They went abroad a lot, very well established. I've got written down, which is quite incredible. They went to 20 international events in 27 weeks. That's a commitment. That's involved, isn't it?
Staggering. The team of mechanics, as they were referred to back then, that supported this racing endeavour were incredible, and they would end up driving through the night. Our most famous technician was a guy called Alf Francis, and
yes, heard of him.
Yeah, I mean Alf came to the business having never touched a race car in his life, set about being one of our mechanics, and really got on well with Sterling. He was part of Sterling's success within the team, and Alf used to drive across Europe, and when he'd get a bit tired overnight, he'd pull over in a little village, stick his head under a well, soak his head, take a shot of brandy, and get back in the cab and carry on driving, and just sort of, matchsticks under his eyelids, that sort of thing, and just keep himself going. But these were guys who just survived World War II, and they were used to this sort of hardship and tough life.
You hear about this a lot, don't you? Even after World War One, and then Brooklyn scene kicked off. You had these soldiers, these warriors who were in the fight in the aircraft, and they took that with them into their lives, and they couldn't just go behind a desk. They had to do something.
I think that's right, and I think all of these people that were fighting for their country and fighting for their lives across quite some period of time came back to an austere, drab UK that was having a bit of a tough time, and I think they needed that spark, that excitement in their life.
Because rationing went on for quite a long time, didn't it? It stopped in the early 50s, I think.
Mid-50s, meat was still being rationed. So it's a long old drag to come out of that period, and so I can understand how these young talented guys wanted something exciting to turn their hand to. It was an adventure again. Alf continued his career with Stirling, so even when Stirling left our team, Alf ended up going with Stirling, and he was one of the best race mechanics of his era.
So in the meantime, John and George were getting the start money, trying to raise funds, but also this site still existed, was still selling petrol, selling parts, and that was also helping to fund the team, wasn't it?
It was. I mean,
though I suspect not to a great extent, but kept it a little bit afloat.
You're dead right. Yeah, it was making a contribution. So we took over this site from Vickers Aircraft after World War II. So Vickers were building and constructing at Brooklands, and this was part of their engineering outfit. And it's a beautiful old building. But yeah, back then we had petrol pumps out front, we had used car offering, we would service cars. We didn't represent any particular franchise, but I mean there was some interesting kit knocking around. So I've got photographs of Bugatti Type 59 that George would race it a bit and give around. The Maserati 6CM. I mean, just all sorts of weird and wonderful bits that are worth staggering amounts of money today. Was just every day coming and going, but it was paying the bills, and it was allowing the race team to continue running. So I can't say that racing was a profitable endeavour. It was simply what John and George loved to do.
So we mentioned some of the names. Any other key drivers, famous names?
Well, yeah. So we talked a lot about Stirling, and you mentioned earlier a few of the names. So Peter Collins started his career with us, and Peter then went on to race for Aston Martin, the Aston Martin Works team, and ended up being world champion with Ferrari before losing his life. Paul Frere, who went on to race for Aston Martin, again was part of the Works outfit that was kind of mid-50s. What I think George tended to do was refer a lot of his drivers across to Aston Martin.
Why would they do that? Because there was no Aston Martin connection at the time, was there?
So Aston, or George was an Aston Works race driver as well as. So this was a period of time where you'd race for multiple manufacturers, and that was all just the done thing. So George had become an Aston Martin Works race driver, and the factory was just up the road. So Feltham is a few miles from where we are today, standing today. And so, George knew the team, there was a good relationship there, and his eye for spotting this talent, he liked to see his drivers move on and progress, and he was committed to Aston Martin as well. He wanted to see them do well. So we also had Duncan Hamilton race for us, Louis Chiron, that the Bugattis named after, later on in his career raced for us. But probably there are so many other names, but probably my favourite driver for HWM is Lance Macklin.
Yes.
Now Lance is the most loyal racing driver we ever had. He had the most starts. I'm always learning interesting things about HWM. Every year that I spend in the business, I learn something new. And there's a few interesting bits that I learned recently. One of them was, now Lance was one of those sickeningly talented guys. He was just a natural sportsman, had that natural sense of balance. So before being a racing driver, he was a fantastic boxer. He was also in the Olympic skiing team, as you do from Surrey. It's a classic skiing spot, as you'll know.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was just one of those guys.
And was he good looking as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, he was good looking as well.
This is quite annoying.
It is staggeringly annoying. His father was Sir Noel Macklin of Invicta Cars. He had various businesses. There was a marine company that helped significantly in the war effort. So his father was quite notable. So he, again, came from a wealthy background. So the thing I learnt about him, I'll tell you a bit more about Lance, but Lance was a great boxer, I mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, what Lance noticed was he used to wear these lace-up boots for boxing. Then he tried them in a race car and he thought, do you know what, I've got a load more pedal feel wearing these boots. Now, if you look at a modern racing driver, they wear these thin-soled lace-up boots.
Yes.
Well, all of that started with Lance, because Lance used to wear them during the race scene, and then other drivers started going, I'll give that a go.
Yeah.
So Lance really started the modern racing boot for racing drivers.
Oh, marvellous.
Great fact. So the thing I liked about Lance was that he was a guy that liked nothing more than a great time. He was more committed to off-circuit activities than on-circuit activities. And Sterling Moss said that he probably learnt more from Lance outside of racing than inside of racing.
Okay.
They had a good time together. But he felt that Lance, if he'd applied himself, would undoubtedly have been world champion. I mean, he had some incredible results regardless. But there was times where, frankly, they might have had practice on if there was a young lady that took his interest more so, he'd absolutely prioritise the young lady over his racing. Yet he'd turn up and just smash it on the day and make it look effortless. He was that kind of guy.
Yeah.
So, something of a James Hunt. And for us, Lance stayed with us despite, again, racing for various other brands. And he was really the bedrock of the team. And this probably leads into why we're no longer a race team, because we're getting into a period, we're talking about a period of racing where it was enormously dangerous. So you look at an HWM race car, like all race cars of this period, no seatbelts, you sit on the fuel tank, and
you're very exposed.
So
your arms are effectively outside, if you like.
Yes.
Grappling with that huge steering wheel.
Exactly right. And the reason why they didn't want the seatbelts is because the cars were so combustible that you'd rather be thrown clear of an accident than be strapped in a car.
Yeah.
The big incident for Lance came in 1955, and there had been various accidents in and around the HWM team. We'd never had anything super serious, thankfully. But 1955, Lance was actually racing in an Austin Healey at Le Mans. He was coming round to the start-finish straight, and just in front of him was Mike Hawthorne, who took a last-minute dive for the pits. So Lance took preventative action to make sure he didn't hit Mike's car, and coming behind was the Mercedes of Levegh, and Mercedes were dominating that year, so it was going faster, and it hit the back of Lance's car. It turned over and flew into the crowd on the start-finish straight, and that was the biggest racing disaster ever. That was 1955 at Le Mans. Awful incident, and a few things happened off the back of that. First of all, Lance, I mean, you can imagine, it weighed so heavily upon him. He was a famous guy back then, so anywhere he went, that's all anybody wanted to talk to him about.
Absolutely.
And he was unsure about his future in racing, and he did one more race at Dundrod, and sure enough, at Dundrod there was a colossal accident that he was kind of in the periphery of, and he finished that and thought, somebody's trying to tell me something here, I need to get out of racing. And so that was the point where we lost our most loyal driver, and sadly you can see Lance's life after that, and it kind of took a gentle downward trajectory, and I think he became more and more of a recluse because he just really didn't want to talk about the Le Mans disaster anymore.
Talking about that Le Mans disaster,
I
think it's been said there was no one individual to blame. If there was anything to blame, it was the circuit, because the way it was designed, something was going to happen. The entrance to the pits, the close proximity of the spectators. I don't think any one individual was to blame. I think it's just circumstances came together which created the chaos, wasn't it?
Well, yes, you're exactly right.
I think Mike Hawthorne was probably the public figure which got the finger, wasn't it? Of blame.
Yeah. So it actually became litigious between Lance and Mike. There was a court action in progress, as it were, over the scenario. And frankly, you're right. It was more circuit setup than anything else. Yeah. And actually, that didn't see its way all the way through. And the reason for that was Mike Hawthorne ended up dying in a car crash on the just near Guildford. Hog's Back. Yeah, not a million miles from us. And that occurred. At the time, it wasn't declared, but essentially, he was racing a guy called Rob Walker, right, who's a well-known racer and race team owner from the region as well. Rob campaigned in HWM back in the day, and I think also Mike had kidney disease as well, and his outlook wasn't so great. But inevitably, it was the car crash that sort of finished everything, and sadly, that was the end of Mike. So it kind of naturally or unnaturally it went away. 56 was another significant point for HWM. So we've spoken about George Abecassis and John Heath, and we probably focused on George's ability as a race driver and John Heath more as an engineer. John still raced, but John was surrounded by the absolute greats of the day.
And you moved into sports cars at this point, hadn't you?
Yeah, exactly right. So racing had become more and more competitive. Manufacturers were getting on their feet. So when we got off the ground straight after World War II, the cost of entry, the barriers to entry were far lower than they had become. And so with a relatively tight budget, John and George decided to pivot to sports car racing. We started using Jaguar engines rather than Alta engines. We became very adept at tuning the Jaguar engines. They were less expensive too. Off the shelf, this was an era where they were essentially XK 140 engines. They helped Jaguar's race team tune their engines too. We were just very good at it. So in 1956, John had a two-seater sports car that he was wanting to prove out, and he signed up to the Mille Miglia, a 1,000-mile road race.
This was John.
This was John. Now, as a team, we did all the big road races. It was standard practice. But John being kind of a secondary level driver in the team, more an engineer, George kind of went, "Are you sure, John? I mean, this is even then it was recognised as a very dangerous, precarious race to enter." And he kind of went, "Well, I've told everybody I'm doing it. I'm doing it." And clearly, as he got close to the race, he could feel something in his waters, because the night before he got the race team together and said, "Look, I've got a terrible feeling about this. I want to write out my will and testament now on this napkin, so we're in this restaurant, and I want you guys to witness it." So that's what he did. And the following day there was terrible weather, and you'll have seen this is a road race where they go hard.
It was madness. Looking at back now, total madness.
Quite. Staggering. And I guess it's this escalation of performance in cars that was the progress over the sort of period that it was on was dramatic in terms of performance, cars going faster and faster. But sure enough, John.
When was this? Late 50s, mid 50s?
56. So this was the year after the Le Mans disaster.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, sure enough, John had a terrible accident, and a few days later he succumbed to his injuries. So we're now at a point in 56 where our key driving force behind the engineering and the business has lost his life. And
it was poignant that he had a bad feeling about this.
Yeah,
you hear this about drivers sometimes. When I read about that, and you've reminded me of this, it brought back to mind about Senna.
Yes,
he had that feeling, not good. And I think Professor Sid Watkins says you don't have to do it. Just leave the car. Let's go fishing. But he went ahead, and sadly.
It's so strange you say that, because
drivers seem to have this sense.
Quite. Yeah, John bumped into his ex-wife before the race and said, "I signed up to this Mille Miglia. I'm not sure whether I should do it." And she said, "Just don't do it, John." And I think it was, this is the way. It's the pressure of, well, I've invited guests.
Yeah.
So we were supporting some racing drivers already. So we at that point, so we did a bit more racing from an engineering support point of view. In the meantime, George had an idea. He wanted to pivot, and what his idea was to build a road car. He was quite a skilled artist, so he sketched out this design for a a really advanced road car. So I mentioned Jaguar at that point were building the XK140, which was quite a rudimentary car compared to what George envisaged. So we'll put an image up of this as well, because there is only one. And the reason there's only one is because George kept on lavishing time and adding complexity to this car. And it became what was the fastest car in the world. It was enormously powerful, and it had all sorts of complex bits, such as things we take for granted today, but electric windows, for example. He created this design on paper, and he went to see his old chum, Frank Feely, who was the head designer for Aston Martin. I say the head designer. The designer for Aston Martin is probably a better description. But of course, Frank was just down the road, and Frank looked at it and said, "Look, listen here, George, I think you've got a bit carried away. Give it to me, and I'll sort it out for you." So Frank did the final refinements to the design, and the car was built, and it was so expensive it just became unsaleable. Finally, George found a home for it, got it sold at a huge loss. That was the end of HWM's car constructing period.
Well, just one car?
One coupe. So he called it George's Folly. Self-named by him. So that was...
Did it bring the company down at that point?
No, it didn't bring the company down, but we were already a busy and successful Aston Martin dealer, and we'll loop back to how that happened. So George just decided to focus on more commercial endeavours. But interestingly...
Does this car still exist?
The car still exists.
All right.
So weirdly, we started by talking about the Streamliner, our first race car, and we finished at the HWM Coupe. Both of those cars still exist today. They both live in Germany, and they're both still used, they're both still raced. And in total, HWM made 19 race cars. They actually made slightly more, but a good number of them were bitsers that were crashed cars that were came back and put together, and all sorts. We never wasted anything. So the official number is 19 real cars, and pretty much all of those are still being used, enjoyed and raced today. And
is it the classic thing of they built 19 and 26 are racing today?
Well,
a bit like the Lotus Cortina.
It's kind of the opposite way around, that there was kind of 26 built, and then they were recycled and turned into new cars, and so that's why only 19 are left. If you go to Goodwood, for example, today, you go to the Revival, you'll always see multiple HWMs racing at the Revival. Our names on the pits there. We've been racing at Goodwood since day one. In fact, George was part of getting it converted into a racetrack. So we've got this long history of being part of the Goodwood scene. So that's lovely. But we're at a point where the HWM road car scene quickly fizzled out. What might have been?
Growing the passion, sharing the stories. The Aston Martin Heritage Podcast.
We're at the point where, sadly, John Heath died. George decided to... So that's the end of the racing side of things. You know, we'll build a few cars. We do some support, but that's the end of the racing.
Yes.
Went into the car production side of things. Did one. That didn't work. So where are we now, in late 50s?
Yeah, so this would have been 57, 58. Now we're already an Aston dealer, so we need to talk about how we became.
Yeah, well, hang on. We jumped. We leapt ahead a bit there.
Yeah, this is kind of.
Up to a point. I think last time we spoke, it was that selling fuel. You was servicing the Bugatti outside or whatever.
Quite.
And suddenly become an Aston Martin. How did that come?
So how did that happen? So we mentioned that racing drivers of that era would race for various teams, and George Abecassis was an Aston Martin works race driver, and a very capable one. He worked under John Wyer, who was a renowned, firm pair of hands.
Yes.
Yes, quite a strict man at the helm. George turned out some great results for John, but in particular, in 1950, he was asked to race a DB2 at Le Mans, and he ended up winning his class with Lance Macklin. So that DB2 still exists. In fact, it was at the Aston Martin Heritage Trust Festival last year.
Yes,
which delighted me. Great to see it. So that was a fantastic result for Aston Martin, but it was also a fantastic result for George, because it did two things for him. one, that was actually where he met Lance. So he secured Lance as a Grand Prix driver for HWM. And secondly, as was the way back then, Aston went, well, you know, you're fantastic at driving, so you should really be selling our cars, George. But you know what? He was fantastic at selling. So the thing about George was he was immaculately turned out. He was very well spoken. He was a really charismatic and engaging guy. So what do you know? He was fantastic at selling cars, and it went really well, that side of the business.
So was it John Wyatt approached and said you should sell the cars?
No, it was Aston Martin corporate and David Brown.
David Brown, yeah.
So that started growing in the background, which is why when the HWM coupe fizzled out, frankly, George wasn't too fussed.
So when was there an Aston Martin on the forecourt here? What year?
51.
51.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's what makes us the longest serving Aston Martin dealer in the world. And that took off really nicely. But the issue George had when John passed was he needed somebody else to help him run the business. So this was 1956. He sort of searched around and he actually knew a young guy called Mike Harting. Now, from Aston. Now, Mike was global sales manager for Aston Martin. He operated out of Feltham. And Mike started at the business, Aston Martin itself, being David Brown's right-hand man. And he progressed to being global sales manager. He was only mid-20s at this point, so a really young guy. He was the youngest sales manager for a manufacturer.
I've got it written down. He was 24.
24.
Just 24 years old.
Yeah.
That's quite something then.
Living the life, driving Astons across Europe. I mean, he's got had some great stories from that era. But what was happening was Aston was relocating the factory to Newport Pagnell.
Right.
So Mike decided he really didn't want to disrupt family life and pull the family up to Newport Pagnell. So he wanted to stay in Surrey. And that coincided with George wanting a business partner. And so it was agreed that Mike would come on board. And Mike, like George, was a phenomenal sales guy and a really, really bright, smart operator. So they got on like house on fire, and the business really got going. Mike did all sorts of wonderful deals, and we've seen some incredible customers come through this business over the years. But one of the notable deals he did early on was with DB4 GT Zagato. Mike and George worked brilliantly together, and definitely Mike, it felt, brought an added spark to the business when it needed picking up after us losing John. And the one thing about being close to the factory is Mike could keep an eye on what was going on there. He noticed at Feltham there were these 3 DB4 GT Zagatos just sitting there. Now, I'm sure many of your listeners will know there were 19 DB4 GT Zagatos made. The reason it was 19 is because Aston simply couldn't sell anymore. It was an expensive product, it was a beautiful product, but frankly, people just didn't get buying expensive.
Why was it originated in the first place? Was it just it seemed like a good idea at the time, do you think?
Yeah, so I think partly there's the marketing side of adding some additional style to the car, but also Zagato were renowned for building lightweight bodies, and so it was a performance element as well. It was a wonderful car, and it wasn't that it was badly thought of, it was just that there was a shortage of people getting their checkbooks out.
Yeah.
So Mike spoke to the factory and said, look, I tell you what, I'll take all 3 of these cars off you, I'll buy them.
So these cars were just lying around?
They were lying around, yeah. So Mike bought them for the business, which was, I mean, that was quite a courageous transaction.
You say bought them, I mean paid money?
He paid money, yeah.
Right.
So he brought back to the dealership and he created this advert in Autocar magazine, and it's still available here. If anybody ever wants to visit the dealership and see some of our history, you're absolutely welcome. So we've got this Autocar advert that talks about the Zagato's performance and about it being for racing drivers who want to drive on track and blast across Europe. To be honest, Aston thought it was a bit racy for their tastes, but do you know what? It worked. And so we sold the last 3 DB4 GT Zagatos. I think they retail for about £6,500 each, and as you'll know today, they're worth, 15 million?
Whoa, yeah.
Yeah.
About $6,500 at that time. That was a lot.
It was a serious transaction, but it was kind of both the best and worst deal we ever did, I guess. But this sort of history of specials, it's something that's stayed with us, and we love dealing with special products. So even the core Aston Martin range is an amazing thing to behold, but then they do these ultra special limited cars, and I think HWM sort of has a name for dealing with these sorts of cars, and I personally adore them. And the wonderful thing about Aston Martin is that you can even create your own via their Q department. So to give you an example of bits that we've been involved with, not only will you see lots of specials lying around here, as you have done today, Garry, as you've turned up, but we started projects such as, these are always with customers, the V600, of which 7 coupes and 7 roadsters were created. Well, that started at HWM with a customer. It was a project we started and ran with Aston Martin from start to finish, which was a wonderful project to be involved with, and a car I adore. But also Project Victor, for example, that started at HWM, and it's wonderful to be involved with these special vehicles. But it really started back from an era where, I mean, the kind of kit that has come through our doors over the years is amazing.
I think you must have seen everything. I mean, you go through your doors, all these specials. It's like you got the mainstream Aston Martin, if we can use the word mainstream, but these specials, I think you've probably touched every one of them along the way.
We have, and with the core cars. So we're the only Aston dealer in the world to have sold every single DB product, for example, from start to finish.
Yes.
So it's great to have
That's
that
something,
history.
isn't it? That's, not to be taken for granted. Not many people would say that.
No, I love that history, but I also enjoy the fact that every year I'm learning something new about the business, and so I mean, about a year ago I had an ex-apprentice make contact. It was actually the son of the ex-apprentice, because it was the apprentice's 80th birthday, and his son said, "Look, could I bring my dad down to HWM just so he can see the place again and reminisce?" At which I jumped at the chance, because any of these opportunities you learn something.
Yes.
And I wasn't disappointed. So I showed him around the business, and so I started talking to him about HWM back in the day, and he said, it was great fun, and I used to work for Mr. Abecassis, because it was Mr. Abecassis, not George. And he said, all sorts of things used to happen. So, for example, I'd get a phone call from Mr. Abecassis, and he'd say, "Listen here, dear boy, could you bring an Aston up to the farm?" And George lived in this big farm with a big drive that went up by a lake. And so the apprentice would take the car up to George's farm, and George would say, "Right, okay, stay there, back the car up, and hook on some rope onto the back of the car." And he'd have to drive the car down George's lane whilst George would jet ski off the back of the Aston.
No.
That was George. The other thing he was telling me was that...
if only there were photographs.
I know. They'd go out and do testing with the race cars, and in those days they'd just run the Grand Prix car on the road. That's just kind of what you did. And there's a very well-known road called Seven Hills Road. 7 hills because it's got 7 sort of humps, as it were, down it. And they'd take the car out and test it there with a bit of chalk. The apprentice would have to get out and stand at the peak of the hill, and then they'd drive flat out well into the hundreds, probably 130, 140 miles an hour, and jump the car off the peaks of Seven Hill Road and see how far they could jump it, just as part of thorough testing, I think they call it.
Yeah, I can understand that, yeah.
And then the final thing he mentioned to me was that George, the way he would drive on the road, being an ex-racing driver, but also this sort of devil-may-care attitude, he just felt when it was your time, it was your time. Until then, have a great time. George would, first of all, create an extra lane in 2-way roads where he'd drive down the middle, and he was just... he couldn't understand why everybody didn't just overtake constantly down the middle of the road and works on the basis that people would get out of your way. And come home time, George was renowned for driving across Walton Bridge, and there's another garage just down the road where there's a roundabout, and he'd have it on the opposite locks. He'd oversteer all the way around the roundabout, do a lap, and then disappear off into the distance mid-afternoon off home. And they could kind of set their clocks by George doing that every day pretty much. So it could be said that he had a good time. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
I do.
That was lovely. But someone took the initiative, say, wanted to share that story with you. Just have a look around.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
You just pick these things up. I had Lance Macklin's first wife get in contact with the business, who's a wonderful person. It's Lady Montague Brown, and she's got so many amazing stories. And you get an idea of how small the racing community was back then, that everybody knew each other, and we were kind of a prime stop off on the way to Goodwood, because we're kind of in the middle of it's on the route down from central London through to Goodwood. So racing drivers of the day would just pop in, and everybody knew George and John, and so all sorts of racing drivers would knock about here. But she also told me another fact that I had passed me by, I didn't know. There's a chap called Peter Yates who used to work for us, and Peter Yates went on to direct Bullet, the movie.
Oh, Steve McQueen movie.
Yeah, brilliant. He
used to work here, did he?
He used to work at HWM. I had no idea. So it's this kind of business that just every year I find some new stories about.
Isn't that great?
It's great. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So it's an honour and a delight to sort of run a business like this day to day.
And also, Gorgeous George was married to someone quite famous.
Yes, you're quite right. So, well,
I say famous.
They should make a film about this, because both John and George ended up leaving their wives. John ended up with a very beautiful model, and George ended up dating the daughter of David Brown, Angela Brown. And she was really quite young. He was married, and it all sorted itself out, and he ended up marrying Angela, making an honest woman of her, and they spent the rest of their lives together. So it's not why we became an Aston dealer, but I guess once it was in the family, there was no turning back.
You're telling a story, and I'm getting right from the beginning, you're saying something. John Heath, Aston Martin, George, Aston Martin, Sterling Moss, Aston Martin. Aston were always in the background, weren't they? I think partly because, as you say, they were only up the road. They were in Feltham, so yes. They had and it was a close knit community, the motor racing and the motor industry. The more I do these podcasts, I'm finding it's more tangled.
It's all interlinked.
It's all interlinked, and it is very close, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But a magical era that that still resonates in our business today.
Now, you're exclusive Aston Martin.
We are
now.
Yes.
Now, if I may recall, it hasn't always been the case. You've been with Aston Martin, I think, back in the 70s. And not only were there Aston Martins here, but you're also a British Leyland dealership, I understand.
Well,
I remember seeing those cars. So you had a dedicated Aston Martin area, but to the right was Morris Marinas and things.
Absolutely. Frankly, first of all, one of the most remarkable things about us being the longest standing Aston Martin dealer is the fact that we survived all that period.
Yes.
Because if you look at volume levels during some of the years, they are a handful.
Well, how did you survive when you come? I suppose it was on the servicing side, was it?
We always needed.
It wasn't on selling.
We always needed an additional franchise to keep us going. So over the years, we've had everything. So first notable one was we've spoken a lot about Lance Macklin. Probably my fault, because I think he's such an interesting character.
Yes.
When Lance fell out of racing, he went to be the global sales manager for Facel Vega, French brand, kind of like the French Rolls-Royce, but it was a bit more dynamic and probably ostentatious, I suppose. What do you know? We ended up with the Facel Vega franchise, and we became the distributors for Facel Vega, much to George's surprise. The kind of customers that bought them were very, very interesting. So it was from rock stars to general people in and around what we might refer to these days as media, to possibly the odd shady character as well. It was kind of one or the other, but fantastic franchise to have for a period of time until they went pop. So Mike Harton tells me a story of that they were at the London Motor Show, and they got news that morning that Facel Vega had gone pop, and HWM owned 2 cars on the stand. George said, look, this is a terrible problem, Mike. We own 2 expensive cars. The business is dead. What do we do? And Mike said, don't worry, George. Leave it to me. I'll sort this. And by lunchtime, he'd sold one of them to Ringo Starr and the other to the playwright Lionel Bart. And the rest of the day was spent having lunch, which is what George liked to do more than anything else in the world.
He did the job in the morning.
Exactly right.
Let's have lunch.
Yeah. That's
the way to do business.
That's the way to do it.
Is that for you now? Is that how it works? You do your business in the morning and then...
Sadly not. No,
okay.
and no oversteering round roundabouts on the way home these days. But
not quite what I've heard, guys.
I wouldn't like to comment. But there has always been an additional franchise. I mean, everything from, British Leyland to, bizarre brands. Isuzu we had.
Oh, cool.
My favourites is we were the sole distributors for DAF. Now, this was the period where it was the DAF Variomatic.
Variomatic, the elastic band gearbox.
CVT transmission. It was... I mean, if you haven't seen one, you should Google it. But it is not the most glamorous or pretty of cars.
It's a strange looking thing.
And we
took 33.
Yeah, and we took on the franchise, and the cars just kept on coming to the point where it was starting to get in the way of cash flow. So Mike looked for a way to fund it, and you may know that dealers have kind of stocking plans where they finance the cars short term. Mike bumped into a bit of an old contact, a chap by the name of Bernie Ecclestone, who did the stocking plan for us. And to be fair, Mike said he was good as gold, absolutely brilliant to deal with, and we got the cars sold, and bit by bit paid Bernie off. Job done. So it's amazing the people you bump into this brand. But there's always been a secondary franchise. Today, as modern HWM, it's Caterham, which we love as well. It's complementary that it's not...
Yes, because you now... so we've got Aston Martin, which has been there all throughout.
That's right.
You had these various other franchises to add volume, if you like.
Yeah.
We spoke about British Leyland and DAF. You have HWM sports cars.
We do, yep, so we buy and sell sports cars.
So that covers...
anything sporty or interesting.
Sporty or interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it was about a year or two ago, HWM Caterham.
Yeah, so it's lovely. It's a British hand-built product. Nobody will buy one instead of an Aston or vice versa, but there's plenty of customers who
buy both.
Quite right. And there's a lot of similarities in as much there's a long wait for a Caterham. It is a very bespoke car. It's a really nice bedfellow. And it's a lot of fun. So
is it going well? That franchise?
We're really enjoying it. So it's a great combination for us.
We've mentioned Mike a few times. Where did you come in, Guy?
Fine. So Mike. So we said Mike joined the business in 58.
58, yeah.
And he remained with the business until 2021, where he sadly passed. So he hit 90, and he was. Up until the end.
Was he working to the end?
Yeah, so day to day he wasn't in the business, but he would come to board meetings and so on.
He'd have contacts as well.
And more than anything, he was the kind of guy that I could phone up and say, Mike, do you remember this DB5? And not only would he remember all about that particular car, he'd tell you where they went for lunch with that customer that day, and he'd give me 2 or 3 brilliant anecdotes to go with it. He was that kind of guy. So always great fun. And an incredible memory, and the people he'd met over the years. I mean, when he passed, he would have been the most experienced Aston person, really, I think, in existence. So Mike, as he hit his 70s, so Mike passed when he was 90. As he hit his 70s, he contemplated selling HWM. He was getting to that point, and Andrew, his son, was a partner in a law firm in New York. And he spoke to Andrew about it, and Andrew said, well, look, you can't sell the business. Andrew had known it all his life. I tell you what, I will finish up, I'll bring the family back, and I'll run the business. So Andrew ran the business before me, and then I took over from Andrew, and Andrew is still our chairman today.
And he's very loyal to the site, very loyal to Aston Martin?
Absolutely. I mean, he's known the business since being a boy, and it used to be his part-time job here, filling up cars in the petrol station and so on. So it's part of him.
I mean, the site hasn't changed much, has it? I mean, you look outside, you look back at the period photographs. You you can see the join.
You absolutely can. Yes, the building and so on. The facade is
it listed now?
No, it's not. But it's a beautiful building that we're very protective of, and again we'll put up some photos of back in the day. You'll be able to recognise it. But really, the big change is the petrol station went probably, I think, about 20 years ago. So it's all forecourt now.
You've been here on this site for what, over 70 odd years?
Yeah, that's right.
As long as you're here,
yes,
and Andrew are here, you're not going to move.
No, well, I think we're so well placed.
Yes,
we're near enough to London for it to be accessible for those that live in the city. Yet we're easy to get to if you're coming from outside of the London area. But not only that, we're so attached to the building. There's so much history here. It's a landmark. We're synonymous with being in this building. It would be very difficult to leave.
I think it would be very difficult to leave. I mean, it is an iconic place and so much great history. Guy, I must thank you for your time. I really did want to cover the HWM story, and I think we have done it justice. Probably as soon as I switch off the microphone, there'll be other things as well.
I'm sure.
But we can cover those again, and probably will hopefully invite us back again to cover other subjects, and if there's something that you remembered, we can just slot it in.
Fantastic.
Guy, thank you very much.
Thanks, Garry.
You're listening to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Discover more about the story of Aston Martin, the cars, the people, the history with the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. You're always welcome to visit us at our museum in Oxfordshire, so find out more via amht.org.uk.